Thank you very much, Andreas, for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yeah, I would like to start today speaking about your book, which was just an extraordinary resource. It continues to be the Digital Diplomacy Conversations in Innovation in Foreign Policy. Tell us, how did the idea came about and how did you gather all that material too? Because it's an extraordinary number of people who speak about the impact of social media on digital diplomacy.
It's kind of shocking to me that actually the book came out 5 years ago. So it was an interesting process for me because it was a very sort of like the idea behind it was not even a book, but was just like for me understanding how digital was changing diplomacy and public diplomacy in general, how social media platforms were becoming part of the conversation and players in the foreign policy arena as well, and how technology was changing not just the way governments and international organizations talk to their audiences, but how, and they engage to their audiences, but also how they approach technology for either solving issues or setting foreign policy priorities, whether it's climate change, whether it's addressing how to perform better services for citizens. So I just started, again, the idea was not writing down a book, but was just like talking to people that either in government, in NGOs or think tank were sort of like approaching technology in different ways, how technology was used by governments and organizations around the world. And those conversations were so sort of like they open for me a new way of looking at technology. And that's why I decided to sort of like put them down, writing them down and sort of like putting them in a book that I thought would be interested for readers around the world that are either practitioners of digital, what we call today digital diplomacy. They were probably people that were studying communications or people that are interested, that work in government and interested, we're getting to know technology a little bit better in a way. And it was one of the very first books on digital diplomacy, and it got very good at me. So I'm very talk to me and work with the that public and all university acquired the book and asked me to talk to their students about how digital diplomacy has been developing through the years and how really digital and technology with the DNA of society to a more technology-oriented side, and we can see it today through this pandemic. We see international organizations and government having summits via virtual meetings, for instance, and that's how really technology is changing some of our work. Of course, I always say that diplomacy is a very traditional sort of tool, and as such, I think that traditional part is still very, very important, sort of like the discussions behind closed doors, the negotiations, governments talking to each other, prime minister and presidents talking to each other. So that part is still very important, but exploring and embracing technology and social media in a different way, I think it's very important.
Yes, indeed, we see that it is impossible. You cannot. I believe maybe 15, 10 years ago, I would hear from diplomats and government officials. They would say, no, we're not dealing with social media. No, my kids are doing that. My kids are on Facebook. Well, guess what? Today, the kids are not on Facebook. They are, but everybody else is on Facebook. All the international organizations have a Facebook page, have a Twitter account. So, and then it's not comes along, Snapchat comes along, which is mostly really short format videos, really, right? And lots of stickers and things you can put. But then at the same time, you are reaching a demographic. So should we be looking into everything that comes along, or what do you say, would you say is the best way to create a strategy if you are a new department within a governmental organization or an international organization? What would be the best strategy?
Well, obviously, I think you talked about kids, and I think kids and the younger generations in general are important voices in foreign policy. They have a say and they want to express it, and governments are starting to understand that in a better way because of social media and because of technology. So I think when you start a strategy or you design a strategy for your organization, whether you're big or small, you have to understand who your audience is. And you have to understand that audiences are very different today than they were 10, 15 years ago. And everybody's sort of interested in expressing their voices. If you mentioned Snapchat, Snap yesterday had the Snap Partner Summit virtually, of course, because of the COVID-19. And they sort of mentioned in very interesting numbers. They, for instance, said that in the first quarter of 2020, they had very big numbers, 229, I believe, million daily active users, 100 million of which, or a little bit more than 100 million, are here in the United States. So if you look at Snapchat, obviously, it's an interesting, very interesting platform. It's privacy centered rather than just like Facebook or Instagram, more public centered, where you share with the world. With Snapchat, you share with your friends and you watch content that is sort of created either by Snap or by partners of Snap. And I think that's why that partner summit was sort of like important to watch. They also mentioned, because they have such a big footing here in the United States, how here in the US they reach more people than Twitter and TikTok combined, for instance, or how they reach more people in the age between 13 and 34 here in the US more than Facebook or Instagram. So I think it's an interesting platform. Of course, when you're a social media team in an organization, whether you're big or small, you have to prioritize where you want to be. There's a study that comes out every year by a public relations company. It's called Diplomat, and they sort of focus mostly on Facebook and Twitter. And you see where sort of those organizations and world leaders, diplomats, ambassadors are mostly on Twitter. Facebook is becoming bigger, but again, you reach a different audience that you would reach with Instagram or Snapchat. And now on the market, you have TikTok, where you have organizations sort of like still doubting whether they want to launch on TikTok, but there's so much interest, especially in markets like the US here. Europe is growing. India, of course, is the first market for them, and they have a different version for China. So the platforms that you have out there are many. According to how big your team is, you have to prioritize and see where you want to be. And content creation is often, can be a struggle. So especially if you have so many platforms, and content, should be diversified according to the platform where you are.
Yes, I've seen TikTok being adopted. You are actually compiling a very nice list that we can find in your website, Digital Diplomacy, on Medium, as well as on your Twitter, through your Twitter. You are updating it constantly of all the organizations, international organizations, multilateral bodies, like World Bank and IMF, that are participating now in TikTok. So what you see is the challenge, really. You say content, yes, because you have to adapt. It's very short. It's really a few seconds, right? What, 15 to 30 seconds max that you can post something. So what are the challenges there in terms? I've seen also you've been posting some things that are quite interesting, like which are the three most peaceful countries according to a survey by, I believe, the United Nations Development Program. So you have things that little bits, tidbits of information that can be quite good to use in a platform such as TikTok. So, but what are the other aspects of content production for specifically TikTok that you have seen that you find interesting?
Well, what you mentioned is the Global Peace Index, which is actually by a think tank in Australia, which branches with branches around the world. But what they compile is an index gathering data around the world. I think most of the data are probably from the United Nations agencies. But I think when you look at TikTok, you look at it as a very informal platform. It was born as a sort of a music kind of platform where people were like sharing dances and their interpretation of songs. Today is a more, it developed in a much bigger platform. They have lots of different users around the world. The US is one of the biggest markets, probably this, I think the second. I think when it comes to content creation, specifically for TikTok, the informality is, I think, very important to understand. You're reaching to a very young audience, oftentimes younger than Gen Z. So it can be daunting for organizations to create either different teams that sort of focus specifically on TikTok. But you can see many different organizations that are sharing the same content through different platforms, across different platforms. And that's fine as well. I think like the opportunity that TikTok creates is that the platform is growing right now. Obviously, there are many concerns in terms of privacy and security, being a Chinese company. Here in the US, they're trying to grow in their team quite a bit and around the world as well, so they can reach out to organizations and develop their For Good and social impact program. And they've done like great work in association and partnership with many different organizations. I think one of the first few to experiment on TikTok was the International Federation of the Red Cross Red Crescent, which sort of created one of the TikTok for Good biggest campaigns, #4Nature, and I invite everybody to look at their feed and what they've done in the past. UNICEF and the European Union have partnered last year during ONGA to create a campaign to reach out to young children and young generations. So you see lots of different best practices. The WHO, of course, during the very beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, they launched on TikTok, and they're now they have the largest following in terms of international organizations, more than 2 million followers. The International Federation of the Red Cross, again, more than 2 million followers. So the best practice, what's interested right now is that you can sort of like create best practices, and you can sort of look at what has been done and maybe like tweak it a little bit and create campaigns that can reach a very large number of people and that have like very large engagement. You mentioned the list that I've been creating. It's interesting to see how it gets bigger and bigger every day, because more and more organizations are joining and launching on TikTok. Whether it's an international organizations, most of them are there right now, whether they're active or not. Even the United Nations, which is actually, if you look at Twitter and Facebook, probably the largest. They have the largest following on those platforms. They're the smallest on TikTok, just because they joined much later than others. You have the FAO, UNEP just joined for World Environmental Day, but also lots of different NGOs, all the different branches of the Red Cross around the world. Most of them are on TikTok. The WWF is there. smaller think tanks, smaller charities. I think there are many opportunities, and I think that's what TikTok is offering right now, and they're very open, as I understand, to creating partnerships for campaigns in the for good, and what we call the for good space.
Excellent. Thank you so much. A pleasure speaking with Andreas Sandre, author of Digital Diplomacy, Conversations in Innovation in Foreign Policy, Press and Public Affairs Officer at the Embassy of Italy in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much, Andreas. A pleasure speaking with you, and we look forward to continuing the conversation on all matters digital diplomacy.
Thank you very much for having me.